So greetings, welcome to you all who are in this webinar, Scouts and the United Nations working together for human rights and the Sustainable Development Goal. First of all, let me thank the Kandersteg International Scout Center for having invited our office to participate in this jamboree on the internet. And also, I would like to congratulate the Center for its 100-year anniversary. I feel particularly happy to be here with you. First of all, because I've been working now with the Scout movement for a number of years in terms of promoting human rights education. And secondly, because I have two children who are participating. They are two Scouts, a cub and an explorer, who are part of the Tanganyika group here in Geneva, which is also celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. My name is Elena Ippoliti. I work at the United Nations Human Rights Office, and particularly I lead the Human Rights Education and Training Unit. And the United Nations, I guess you are aware, is a global organization made of 193 countries, all the countries of the world, that looks after maintaining peace and security in the world. It works with all actors, governments, different organizations, institutions, activists, and its goal is really to improve people's lives towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, which you are, I guess, already familiar with as Scouts, as well as promoting human rights for all around the world. This is about the United Nations. The Human Rights Office of the United Nations is a UN department that has a specific focus on leading and coordinating the work on human rights. It is based in Geneva, Switzerland, and we have around 2,000 staff at headquarters here in Geneva, in New York, and in various offices all over the world. We help states to protect and promote all human rights of all people, and we work closely with all institutions and organizations in this regard. And of course, the Scout movement is a very important partner for us in this work to promote and protect human rights. Next. I would like to point out the three main issues I will cover during this session. I hope we will have a dynamic session. The first point is just to clarify that really human rights and the SDGs are a common agenda for the Scouts as well as for the United Nations, so that we are working together on these issues. Then I will focus a bit more on what are human rights and how they relate to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, because I think many of you may be very familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals and maybe less with human rights, we'll see. And then my last point would be, how do you as individual Scouts can engage for human rights and the SDGs? And we will see examples of Scouts who are already engaging. I also would like to tell you that during this session, you will be very welcome to write in the chat your inputs. I will ask you for inputs at a certain moment, but also your comments or questions. And we have Assad, who is our moderator, who will also be monitoring the chat and send me the information. Okay, next, let's start with the first point. Human rights and the SDGs, a common agenda for the Scouts and the United Nations. So, as I mentioned, we have been working together already, and we are working together, United Nations and the world and the Scouts movement, for promoting human rights and the SDGs. And I would like really now to show you an example of this cooperation, which has actually taken place last year. And it was the 2022 Swiss National Jamboree. The Swiss Jamboree takes place only every 14 years. And for this, the 2022 Jamboree, we really had a good cooperation, which you will see and I will comment later. So please go ahead with the video number 1.
What do you call an event that happens only every 14 years and gathers 30,000 youth for 2 weeks? It's the Swiss Scouts National Jamboree, the Bula, its short name in German, or the MOVA for Mouvement in French. From 23rd July to 6th August 2022, thousands of scouts from all over Switzerland and a few hundred from abroad gathered in the Goms Valley in the canton of Valais for a 2-week camping extravaganza. After a global pandemic that wreaked havoc on economies and saw inequalities spike, the time was ripe to rekindle a discussion about human rights and the sustainable development goals with youth from every corner of our host country. An enthusiastic multi-agency group of UN staff headed to the camp to meet young people face to face, talk about the United Nations work, and raise awareness about the need to defend and protect human rights as the foundation for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Through rich conversations and exchanges, the United Nations left thousands of Swiss youth reflecting on the world and the future that await them. In the global village, at one end of the camp spanning 165 hectares, more than 600 scouts came mornings and afternoons to the United Nations tent to learn about human rights. Focusing on diversity and inclusion, one of the camp's themes, the workshop delivered by UN staff in French, Italian, and German had clear objectives. Through a range of interactive activities, the workshop aimed to achieve a common understanding that all human beings are equally deserving of dignity, respect, and justice. Meanwhile, near the village of Ulrichen, on the camp's main boulevard, the United Nations stand welcomed hundreds of scouts and other guests daily. They came to discover, ask questions, and offer solutions on how to create a more sustainable world by tackling the world's many challenges. The unique 2-week gathering proved an exciting venue for the United Nations to connect with youth and the Scout movement. Brought UN agencies and colleagues together, working as one to highlight the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals and how youth can be a driving force in achieving progress on them by 2030.
Yes, so this was actually a very interesting cooperation because as my colleague was narrating, we had the specific workshops for groups of 25 scouts where we looked at human rights, what they are, but also how really scouts can get engaged in this in human rights work. And I would say that a large part of this presentation builds on those workshops we delivered at that time. I then like now to start looking into my second point for this presentation, which is actually what are human rights and how they relate to the Sustainable Development Goals. This will be let's say, the main part of the session. But again, before me starting talking about these issues, I would like to see if any of you would like to provide some examples of human rights that you could write in the chat. Do you have some ideas of some human rights? Would you like to try and put in the chat some of the ideas about that? Basic needs for people like food, right to food, water, shelter. Thank you. Thank you, Zamir. Yes. Very good. What else? What else? It's important. Yes, this issue of needs. What else do you need to be able to live a dignified life? Yes, examples of human rights. Yes, right to practice culture. Thank you. Thank you very much, Francis. Yes, that's very important. What about you, for instance, going to school or going to your right to religion, right to life? Thank you. For you to be able to right to education, freedom of thought and expression. Thank you, Naida Jarvis. Thank you, very good. Yeah, we have quite already a number of them. And what I'm gonna do now is to ask for the next slide to be shown. The next slide provides you with the list of rights, the rights which are contained in the main document that everybody uses who works on human rights, which is called the main United Nations document on human rights, which is called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Can I see in the chat, has anybody ever heard about this document? Is anybody who can tell me if you ever heard about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? I see not so much feedback on that. Okay, that's important. That's why we're having with this webinar. So the Universal Declaration is, as I mentioned, the most important document that everybody's using. Everybody works on human rights, whether it's the United Nations or NGOs like non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International, the Scout movement. They are referring also to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the main document that was adopted by the United Nations in 1948. It was a long time ago, just as a reaction to the Second World War, because countries got together at that time and decided that they didn't want to see anymore such a horrifying war and atrocities that took place at that time. So they gathered together, they created the United Nations in 1945, and then they developed a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was to be really a standard of achievements for all people and all nations, for the rights that every human being should be entitled to. And there is this first article, as you see in the first box. You will see you have 30 boxes because every box is an article of the Universal Declaration. And the first box says free and equal, which is Article 1, which says that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. It's a very powerful sentence that you will see probably written in many different places where human rights meetings take place. I would really welcome you to read this document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You will find it very easily. For me, it was very enlightening. I read it when I was 18 years old, and I still remember that day. And I still remember that that was the moment when I read this document that I decided I wanted to work for human rights in my life. And I started working with Amnesty International at that time when I was 18. And then I continued in various organizations, and right now in the United Nations. So it's really a document that I would like to recommend you to read. And you will see that touches upon many rights. Some of them you mentioned, like the right to life, freedom from slavery, freedom from torture, access to justice, right to a fair trial, freedom from arbitrary detention, right to privacy, freedom of movement. You see some of those that you mentioned yourself. Right to marriage, to have a family, to own property, religion of belief, expression, assembly, right to participate in public affairs, to work, to rest, and to adequate standard of living. That was the first one that was actually mentioned in the chat. But also cultural, artistic, and scientific life that was mentioned later by Ramses. And of course, there is also something about the duty to the community, the rights that every individual has, but also the duty that every individual has towards its community. So next. I just wanted just a little bit to focus on these two words because we mention them regularly, human rights. But why, can we reflect a little bit on these two words? Why we call them human and why we call them rights? Does any of you want to contribute something on this? Why human? Why they're called human rights and not just rights? Anybody would like to contribute on that? Okay, let's see what we have on the slides. Next. They're human because they belong to every human being. So they cannot be taken away because we can't say human being, no, you are not a human being. They really belong to every human being. And in that sense, they are universal. And they belong to every human being without discrimination. Now, the second word, rights. Why we call them rights and not values, let's say, human values? Why we call them rights? Anybody would like to say something on that? I'll just wait a few seconds. Because they are for everyone, yes, that's for sure. But they are rights. They are not just universal for everybody, they are rights. And let's see why we call them rights next. Because there are specific laws that protect them. And it's rights and they're inherent to the human beings, I can see from the chart. But the important thing is they're not just values, but they are rights because they are written in the laws. And we will look into which type of laws very, very quickly though, but just for you to have an understanding. Okay, so they are human because they belong to every human being without discrimination, and they are rights because they're protected by laws. Okay, I will now go to the next slide and ask our Scouts colleague to show us this brief video of Amnesty International Switzerland, which is entitled Human Rights in 2 Minutes, which will give you a bit of an idea of what human rights are and the history of that. And I will give you more details later. Thank you.
(1948) rings a bell? Oh, yes, of course. It was in the last century, Grandma and Grandpa's generation. Legend has it that there were still dinosaurs hiding in caves up in the mountains. But that is something we're really not sure of at all. Back then, everyone was recovering from the Second World War and its 70 million dead, the most devastating conflict in human history. So in 1948, to make sure such atrocities would not happen again, the search for shared values began. Why? Have people unite around a strong symbol, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What is less known is that it was adopted by the UN General Assembly and has become the most translated text on Earth. But what are human rights? The rights you are entitled to simply because you are a human being. In other words, everyone benefits from them from birth, without exception or distinction. The idea behind it is that these rights are like needs. They are absolutely necessary to live well. Without them, it would be the law of the jungle, and you'd risk being beheaded if your government didn't like your Facebook status. In the Declaration's 30 articles, there are the civil and political liberties, such as the right to life, the right to vote, freedom of expression, or the prohibition of slavery and torture. Rights are interdependent, indivisible, and interrelated. This means that if a right is not respected, a series of other rights won't be either. If you are homeless, you live in the streets, so you can't sleep. You get sick, you don't go to school, and won't find a job. Violation of the right to adequate housing triggers the violation of the right to rest, the right to education, the right to work, etc. These are economic, social, and cultural rights. Okay, so a great text was agreed upon, but who does what? Well, on paper, the state's mission is to take the necessary measures for the Declaration to be respected. But in reality, there are some very bad students. The Declaration is not a legislative text, it's an ideal. Its name says it all. It is a declaration. Therefore, it is not valid in a court of law. But most states have integrated human rights in their constitution, and therefore, they must guarantee them. You can defend human rights only if you know them. Everybody's role is to ensure they are respected. Collective conscience means that each and every person is responsible for everybody else's well-being. Therefore, we can all get involved, protest against injustices, and make the universal rights ideal succeed.
Thank you. Thank you. So, as you saw, the Universal Declaration, as you saw, it's also an important document for Amnesty International, which is another organization that works for human rights and is present a bit all over the world. You heard that the declaration is the most translated document in the world. Yes. This is a project that our office has been carrying out since 1995. And yes, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has the Guinness World Record for the most translated document in the world, over 500 different translations in indigenous languages, minority languages, all national languages, and so on. So I really welcome you to look for your own version of the Universal Declaration, or if you don't find it in our website, which I will give you at the end of the conversation, to work for a translation. Why not? We need to keep this Guinness record alive to make sure that the word universal, it's really the right one for the Universal Declaration. Next, please. Just to clarify, you heard that what the video was saying is that human rights have been incorporated into national law. And that's an important thing to know, because again, it's not just the Universal Declaration that is an international instrument that contains the human rights that all human beings are entitled to, but in many national laws, starting from the Constitution, you find human rights, usually in the introduction of the constitutions. You find also human rights spelled out in regional law. You may know that in different, I saw there are colleagues from Brazil, for instance, here, scouts. There is an inter-American system for human rights. There is a European system for human rights, the Council of Europe. And so in different regions, you have regional law that is adopted by a group of states in that specific region. And the one point that I wanted to make about international law is that a bit differently from what it says, the video, after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, as we said, is not really enforceable in the courts, even if there are discussions about that, states have been adopting treaties, which are called treaties or agreements, conventions, which makes actually human rights applicable actually to national legislation and can be enforced through the law and through the courts. There have been several agreements that governments signed and agreed with. In 1966, you had two main ones on civil and political rights, like the right to vote, freedom of movement, and so on. And another one on economic, social, and cultural rights, like adequate housing or the right to food and so on. And then many instruments were really developed to protect specific groups. I'll put here four, which is a very important one, about women, children, the rights of the child, migrant workers, and the persons with disabilities. Would anybody know why I put rights of the child in yellow like that? Do you know? Would anybody know in this audience? Otherwise, I can tell you. Is because this agreement about the rights of the child is actually the one that has been agreed almost by every country in the world, every government in the world. It's in legal terms, we say it's the most ratified document in the world. In addition, there are different international instruments that combat specific violations of human rights, such as, for instance, agreements to combat racial discrimination, to combat torture and inhuman treatment, or to combat enforced disappearances. So this is just to give you a sense of what human rights are about. I just would like to stop here a second to see if there are any specific questions from what I said up to now, before we move to the relationship between human rights and the Sustainable Development Goals. Anybody would have a question? I'd be happy to take any question. Okay, so I will continue, but feel free to write the questions in the chat, because Assad will share with me your questions, and we will be able to tackle it at the end of the session. So I would like to move now to the next slide a bit, because I noticed very much that in the Scouts movement, there is a lot of conversations around the Sustainable Development Goals, and maybe not so much in the same way about human rights, but this is growing. And I wanted just to make some links between these two frameworks, which are both United Nations frameworks to improve people's life everywhere in the world. So people usually explain the relationship between human rights and the SDGs as them being two sides of the same coin. If you look at the SDGs, I think you are quite familiar with this colorful presentation of the Sustainable Development Goal. You will see issues like zero hunger, or quality education, or clean water and sanitation. Now, it is clear that to achieve a world with no hunger, we need to make sure that the right to food of all people is respected, right? So you can see here the relationship between, for instance, SDG 2 and human rights, which is the right to food. The same we can say about education. You know, the idea that everybody will have access to quality education means that everybody will have their right to education respected. So, as I said, you can look at the SDGs and human rights as two sides of the same coin, and we can see it in the next slide, some specific example of in the first column, you have the SDG, and in the second column, you have human rights. As we were saying, the SDG 4 is about ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. In human rights terms, you would call this the right to education, equal rights of women and girls in the field of education, the right to work for also the teaching profession. If we look at Sustainable Development Goal 5 on gender equality, which is achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, you will see that in human rights terms, that would mean elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, or the right to decide on the number and spacing of children, or special protection for mothers and children, or eliminating violence against women and girls. So this would be the human rights terms that contribute to the SDG on gender equality. And if you look at, for instance, SDG 6, ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all, this is written in human rights law as a right to safe drinking water and sanitation, right to health, and equal access to water and sanitation for rural women. All these acronyms or in that you see are, for instance, if you can recognize UDHR would be Universal Declaration of Human Rights. CEDAW would be the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. CRC would be the Convention on the Rights of the Child. ISERSC would be the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So just to tell you that behind those little acronyms, there are all these instruments of international law that I was mentioning before. Okay, so this was really to see that human rights and SDGs are really a whole, rather than two separate frameworks of the United Nations. Next. Who is responsible for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and for the promotion and protection of all human rights for all. Actually, the states have the main responsibility, all states in the same way. Next. Not only the states, actually, at the national level. Of course, the governmental agencies, but also other national institutions, like, for instance, national human rights institutions, which are specific institutions in many countries that really focus on the promotion and protection of human rights. Civil society organization, we mentioned Amnesty International, but even the Scouts in every country. These are organizations of civil society that contribute to human rights and are responsible. Of course, the courts, when it comes to enforcing human rights through a legal framework. We can go to the next two. Of course, you have also regional actors, regional organizations that I mentioned, regional courts that focus on respecting, promoting respect for human rights in the region, or international actors. And the United Nations, for instance, is one of those, but also the international tribunals. You may have heard about the international tribunals on the former Yugoslavia or Rwanda. So these are all, let's say, bodies that are responsible for the promotion and protection of human rights, but not only. Next. As a matter of fact, everybody, every person, including each of you and including myself, each of us, we have a responsibility and we have a role in the promotion and protection of human rights. Next. Particularly Scouts. Scouts have been engaging in protecting human rights and in promoting the Sustainable Development Goals through specific projects in many countries. And I wanted actually to show you a video, a very short video of a colleague of yours, a young scout, Mariana, who is telling us about examples of projects that the Scouts have led in different parts of the world to promote the SDGs and human rights.
Hello, my name is Mariana and I'm a scout from Mexico. Scouting is all about helping young people become agents of positive change. We take part in programs and create projects that help us grow as active citizens. When I was 10 years old, I created a donation campaign called Donate Hair, Donate Hope, collecting hair and breast to donate to cancer hospitals. My campaign grew so big that this is still ongoing and runs across Mexico. I'd like to tell you about a couple of my fellow scouts and their missions. Meet Kellen from Ireland. He started a delivery service on his bicycle to deliver groceries, medicines, and other essentials to elderly and at-risk people in his town. And this is Kim from Canada and has been supporting healthcare workers by 3D printing earwax to make masks more comfortable to wear. Our scout promise is help build a better world. I really believe we can be change makers and peacemakers. We can lead the way.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I must say that personally, I witnessed the Scouts getting engaged in human rights work during the pandemic. When, for instance, here in Switzerland, we had a period of confinement. I think it was a bit all over the same, all over the world. I was often with my children on the balcony of my apartment, and I could see Scouts on the bicycles delivering food for elderly people in my neighborhood. That was a beautiful example of, for instance, Scouts were contributing to, for instance, the right to food and to solidarity with the people more in need, the people, for instance, elderly people who couldn't leave their houses. Other ideas of what Scouts can do, in addition, we had a really great idea of the things that are already going on. I put some down that were suggested during the workshops in this Jamboree. And some ideas that came out of those conversations were, for instance, first of all, to learn more about human rights, and then share and educate others, particularly those of you who have also responsibility of managing younger Scouts, the important role that you have to educate them also on human rights. Of course, they were saying also be an example in terms of respecting others, having empathy, and promoting dialogue for resolution of conflict, for instance. Other ideas were to discuss within your Scout group, because of course, you know, the priorities or the things you can do could be different in different countries, in different communities. They also mentioning mapping the local organization you could work with. I mentioned one, Amnesty International, which is very, very diffused and present in many countries. But why not? Many other organizations could be organizations that the Scout groups could join in working together. And of course, identify and carry out projects useful for your community. You saw Mariana's and other projects that were really coming out of the need of your community. And the idea would be to see what would be more useful around you for things that you could do. I put a lot of dots there because there were so many others. I remember there were many young Scouts speaking about taking action to help migrants. For instance, in Europe, in Switzerland, there is a big wave of migrants from Ukraine. So they were saying maybe they could organize some conversation classes for Ukrainian children on the languages of Switzerland, which are 4, as you know, or you may know or may not know. But anyway, we have 4 languages here. So just ideas that were coming out of the realities of the Scouts in their own, in the context of Switzerland, for instance, because this was the Swiss Jamboree that I mentioned at the very beginning. And let me close with this last slide, because next, because many of the things I said and much more than that many more information is available on the website of my office. You will see there the website address, which is www.ohchr.org. This acronym stands for Office High Commissioner Human Rights.org. You will find a lot of resources there for different purposes. Of course, you will be able also to locate our United Nations offices in your country or in your region, and establish some partnership with our colleagues in the field. But also do not hesitate if you are interested and you want to know more, or you are looking for some advice of how to proceed, to get in touch with us directly in the headquarters in Geneva, in the UN Human Rights Office, through the KISC International Scout Center, who is hosting this session. I have covered everything I wanted to say for this session. I would just like to know if there are some questions. We are just right on time of our 45 minutes. And if you have any feedback or any questions, feel free to ask it at this moment. I will also provide, I'm happy that Lisa mentioned that this was a great presentation. I'm happy, amazing, thank you. I would like to say that this presentation will be available in a PDF version. We will make it available for distribution, so whoever wants to receive it can get in touch with the KISC International Scout Center. I really encourage all of you to become part of this international movement for human rights, because as a matter of fact, as I said, we are all responsible for promoting and protecting human rights around us, and be part of the work that the UN is promoting all over the world. So please, as a last advice, I would like really to advise that you go and read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's a very short document, but it's one of the most powerful documents I've ever read in my life. It changed my life. I hope it will change yours too. Thank you very much for your attention. Any question? Thank you very much for the nice feedback. I'm really happy that you appreciated it. And again, as I said, take action, take action. Take action for human rights and for the SDGs. It's all in our hands, in your hands, in our hands.